Welcome to Quick Take. I'm your host, Susie, along with James. And I appreciate you, James.
I appreciate you, Susie.
So, James, I was working with an
Sure.
executive team this week, and we were talking just in general about kind of the status of the business and what they're looking to achieve in the next
Eh,
year. And it was kind of a strategy meeting. And they started talking about some changes that had happened in the organization, some layoffs that had affected the team. And
Yep.
it was interesting to me, not that they brought that up because they were looking toward the future and what they didn't have on the team. What really struck me was the layoffs happened more than 12 months ago. And I
Yeah.
even said to them, I said, when did this happen? Did this happen recently? And they were like, they also had to think about the longevity of it. It seemed very recent to them. So I just thought it was interesting. I find that layoffs are very disruptive, and we think about the disruption happening to the person that left. Like we focus so much on that, and we don't really talk about what happens to the people that are still there.
Yeah. It's an easy thing to overlook because you do spend as an executive so much time trying to go through who's going to leave, the financial plan around that. And like many things, we spend so much time on the planning of an event. And once it happens, we don't look at the long term after effects of it. And then I
Yeah.
think layoffs are insidious. They go on forever.
Yeah. It's funny because you think about the person, you think about the package, and you think about the communication plan. And it's almost like then it stops once you press send or what
Right.
you had the conversation. Like, okay, it's over. Clean our hands. That's all. And that's
Right.
not true.
No, not at all. In fact, there's a really interesting company called Culture Amp, and their CTO, or their CEO, and their head of people experience actually just published a study on this in the Harvard Business Review that was just extremely telling. I mean, their analysis says that the impact of a layoff can last as far more than 24 months, and that their research showed that those who are laid off have like a 25% decrease in their willingness to either recommend the company or commit to the company. 25% decrease still after 2 years following that layoff.
Wow.
So it is absolutely devastating. And I think that left to its own momentum, it's really difficult for companies to rebound.
That's so interesting. And it takes, that's such a long time
It is.
to think about that team. It also makes me think about the collective, the
Mhm,
group
mhm.
and the disruption of that and how important it probably is to rekindle that connectivity. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. I think just like anything related to culture, it takes a continuous effort. And I think that you as a leader think that the layoff is done once the desks are empty, and your team will be happy to have survived and continue to be motivated, I think you're sorely mistaken. And I think even if you have a strong culture and you have good artifacts and processes or ceremonies or things in place that promote that culture,
Yeah.
I think you need to, turn the knob to 11 post layoffs to really move that chart back into the positive territory.
I think it brings up such a good point too, that leaders aren't just developing individuals, they're
Mhm,
creating a team, and you really
mhm,
need to think about the collective. I remember Google did a study around the difference between hiring a person or hiring a
mhm.
group, and they made the point that it's a lot better bang for your buck to hire as a collective because this group already kind of knows how to
Yeah.
work together.
I think those events, those things you can do together, just makes a big difference. And I think it's important that you think about it.
Yeah, you think about the individuals and the collective together.
Right, right, right.
So what are your tips for us?
You know, I think one of the most important ones is it kind of bridges the gap, if you will. And I can't help but think about a layoff that Airbnb did in 2020. Their CEO, Brian Chesky, did something really unique, and it got a lot of praise, both in print or media, but also, on the grams. He actually held these transparency and prioritization summits where he actually explained the layoff in detail,
Wow.
explained the packages, the severance packages that the employees got. He even created an alumni talent directory So people who are no longer part of the company, they were alumni, were still part of the talent pool that could either be brought in or be even
Yeah.
recommended for other roles. So by, by really recognizing the situation, being transparent and not avoiding the situation, as painful as it is, I think that what they did there was very unique and created that culture or maintained that culture of connectedness that I think they really were proud of at the time.
I think that's really good. I think that just to also remind people you can have that seance or that meeting, if you
Hmm.
will, but you
Hmm.
also need to be open to the questions that are asked and be
Oh
really
yeah.
thoughtful about the questions. My daughter, they had a similar thing after some layoffs, and nobody was asking questions, and she asked some clarifying questions, and she kind of no, they didn't really answer in the moment, and then she got a message through her boss that she needed to ask her questions differently.
Mm.
And so it changed it changed everything about the intent of that meeting by
Yep.
not really thinking about the questions and how you transparently answer those on the spot.
Right. I know that we have both worked at companies. I think, our listeners have also worked at companies where there's that one individual who will always ask a question.
Yeah,
First
yeah.
question asked at a town hall is always Jerry. First call, first hand
Yeah,
up go is always Tom or Mary or whomever. It's always that one person, and they don't always ask the most, well-rounded,
fair.
well thought through questions. Then you have to be as a leader be prepared for that. And your daughter, maybe not as seasoned, not a senior executive, asked a real question that was probably on the minds of many people, and maybe not the format for that. But if you're not prepared to deal with that in a
Yeah.
professional adult way, maybe that was an inappropriate question. I know your daughter, it wasn't probably, she's very bright.
No, but
But
it's a
let's
good
just
point.
say, worst case scenario, still, you have an
Yeah,
opportunity as a leader to completely move that question to the positive column or the negative
yeah.
column. And it sounded like in this situation, they just really, really continue to dig the hole.
Yeah, didn't do a good job. That's such an
It is.
important like, don't just think about the questions that are gonna be the obvious ones, but really, like, reframe it or really
Mhm.
talk through, "I think what you mean by this." Yeah, I
Right,
know.
right, right.
Uh, uh,
Or if nothing else, just acknowledge it.
yeah,
I hear what you're saying. I really appreciate your question, and I'm sure that's on many of your minds. I'm not really comfortable answering that right now. We don't know. It's still a fluid situation. There's
yeah,
lots of ways to do it, but
fair.
I am constantly surprised how unprepared people are for obvious questions that are coming. But that transparency still goes a long way.
I agree, I agree. Alright, what's your second tip?
The second one I think is really acknowledge the fact that your organization may be changing. You may have a layoff and it may
Mm,
have been skills based or financially based. But I highly recommend recognizing that your teams need to continue to grow and learn and maybe have a skills growth opportunity.
yeah,
Many companies are going out and trying to upskill their employees. I think AT&T did something a few years back. They called it their upskill opportunity, or no, they called it future ready is what they did. And they invested like $1 billion in their existing employees to get them up and more useful and more valuable to the company.
yeah,
And I think as all listeners know as well that keeping an employee and improving their performance is very 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 much cheaper than hiring a new employee. So any investment in an existing employee is certainly going to be better to the bottom line than eliminating that employee and bringing on a new person. So, my second recommendation is really focus on the skill redeployment that you can do within the company to not only motivate the folks, but also eliminate future layoffs.
I think that's great, and I think the mindset what really came to mind for me is
Mm.
the mindset around that, and as a leader, you could say, kind of bridging both of your tip 1 and tip 2 is,
Mhm.
I've really this was hard. I had to really I took a lot of time thinking about the people, but I also spent the same amount of time thinking about how did we need to move forward and how do we look at ourselves a
Right.
little bit differently, and I wanna invest in us so that we can move quickly and kind of stand up and move forward as fast and effective by investing in each one of you.
Yep. I think that's a great message. It feels good. I will say the truth of the matter is I bet that AT&T's budget was $1 billion. I bet you they spent 4 million, in the sense that employees tend not to take advantage of training, and that a lot of that is internal
Huh,
marketing.
yeah.
Certainly, I think I don't know that I've ever worked with a company or been with a company where a department has used all of its training budget. So often it's either zero, when of course then nothing happens. But if there is a budget, employees just simply don't take advantage of it.
Yeah.
And so I do think recognizing that upskilling is important. If you're in tech today, this is a no-brainer, right? Suddenly, 3 years ago, the job opportunities for developers was as high as it could be. And now literally within the last year, the question is whether or not we need developers. So I do think there's a ton of opportunity to talk about what the next skill is, who and where can you fit into the company, and what's the vision, and investing in training, I think, is a great way to do it.
I just want to add too is that you're talking a lot of technology and software and upskilling. I think development as this is a change in terms of you as a leader and getting through
Yep,
this. I think
absolutely.
executive development is also something to consider because you're right. People are overwhelmed by training, especially internally, but maybe how can you get more creative about that?
Well, I think let's just turn my nerd hat off and go, hey, maybe you need to learn how to manage a team that's international.
Yeah,
Maybe you need to learn how to
exactly.
deal with a larger team, a smaller team, a team of skills that you're not familiar with. I think one of the skills that I'm constantly being reminded that many leaders don't have is how to manage people whose jobs you cannot do.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think that's a earth shatterer where, if your skill set was honed in the past and you've been managing people that are adjacent to that, and suddenly those things are gone, leadership and management are two different things. And
Yeah.
I think redirecting and repositioning your skill set for the evolving market, whether it's tech or whether it's, healthcare, finance, all those things, all those industries all are in a state of flux, and adjusting your skills is a great idea.
Yeah. I totally agree. Concur. All right. So what's your third?
And then third is really, I think, identify and create a recovery plan for the
Yeah.
organization that is articulated and clear, and help and support those remaining employees. I know companies have done things like recharge days or had, offsites, or a lot of people that take time off to ensure that you do not have burnout. I think those conversations have become much more prevalent, which I think is great. And again, back to my previous point, companies have learned that losing their existing employees is much more expensive than keeping them. And so keeping an eye out for burnout, giving those remaining employees some processes and some plans and some tools to help them recover, I think is really key.
Yeah. I think that's a good one. And I think that it's so important. If I was giving some tactics to an executive who just made some layoffs, I would say, put on your calendar for you to kind of take note of how people are doing.
Yeah,
What do I need to do? And put that on the next once a month, once every 2 weeks for the next 6 months.
right.
And
And it
just
can't be,
don't just forget. Don't just forget and
yes.
it's over and shut the door because that emotional toll on executive leadership when they have to make those kind of changes is hard. And that's what they tend to want to do. But
Yep.
they have to also invest in the future. So how do you force yourself to do that? Make a check-in for yourself so that you can really take note of how the team is doing.
Yeah. And I think it's so important to do it differently than what you've been doing it before.
Yeah.
Because if you just think that you have one-on-ones and you have staff meetings and you have town halls and that's going to suffice, it doesn't suffice. And
Yeah.
you need to be seen as behaving differently if your employees are going to take you seriously.
Yeah. This is so good. All right. So tell us the 3 tips one more time.
Really, first one, create what I would call a transparency summit. Have a dialogue with the remaining employees so they all understand what happened. Share as much as you can. Be overly communicative so everybody is aware. No information breeds misinformation, and it's always great to get in front of it. Number two, create an initiative that helps upskill the remaining employees. Avoid future layoffs by investing in your employees to give them the skills to ensure that they are the people you need going forward. And then third, put some processes and ceremonies in place for your remaining employees so they do feel valued, so they do avoid burnout. I think one of the things we do so often is we just take the work that came from the people that got laid off and dump it on the existing
Yeah.
employees. That's a double whammy. One, they've got survivor guilt, and two, they're now doing double the work.
Yeah.
You've got to recognize that and really ensure your people don't burn out.
Awesome. So good and so important.